the only question that matters. What does my nervous system need to repay this debt? This is not emergency stress, it's chronic.
Check, check one, check, check.
This is where things get interesting. Well, it's all interesting, but up to this point in the series, we've talked about the two biological modes, survival and regulation. We've also talked about how regulation supports clarity, learning, connection, and repair. But today, we're going to look at what happens when survival chemistry doesn't shut off. Because stress, biologically speaking, is not bad, but it's super expensive. And what I mean by that is stress is a short-term loan the body takes out to meet a demand. When you need energy fast, a quick little energy hit, your cortisol rises. And when you need immediate action, adrenaline increases. And when attention needs to narrow, the nervous system tightens the focus. In short term, this works beautifully. You meet the demand, you solve the problem, and then the body is supposed to return back to regulation. That's the full cycle. Problem is, when the repayment never happens, in other words, it doesn't return to the safety state, modern stress rarely has a clear beginning and an end. You know that. Deadlines roll into the next task and notifications arrive before the nervous system recovers. Anticipation replaces resolution. From a biological standpoint, the body remains in a state of mobilization. Cortisol stays elevated just enough to keep the glucose circulating. Adrenaline remains present at low levels. Muscle tension never fully releases. This is not emergency stress, it's chronic, and it's a chronic activation of it. And the body responds accordingly, of course. And one of the first systems affected is your energy regulation. Cortisol's role is to make fuel available. But when the cortisol is elevated in a long-term situation, the body becomes less efficient at burning that fuel or using that fuel. So people feel wired but tired. It's an old bumper sticker, but it's there for a reason. And they feel alert but depleted. Their sleep architecture begins to fragment. That's what's going on. And deep restorative sleep shortens. The body loses its primary repair window, which is sleep, which is deep sleep. Another major impact shows up in inflammation. There's a good one. Cortisol is anti-inflammatory in the short term, at least by our understanding of it. But chronically elevated cortisol eventually disrupts immune signaling altogether. Inflammation markers rise. And this doesn't always show up as illness immediately. It often will just show up as joint stiffness, digestive discomfort, brain fog, there's a good one. Your heightened sensitivity, and you're irritable. Your mood is unstable. Mood instability is a better way to put that. The body is signaling an overload. And then next, stress chemistry begins to interfere with neurotransmitter balance. Serotonin production and receptor sensitivity are affected. Impulse control weakens. Emotional regulation becomes harder. Dopamine becomes very erratic. Instead of supporting steady motivation, it spikes in short bursts, often driven by stimulation rather than by meaning. Doomsday scrolling is a good example of that. So people seek relief without knowing why. They're scrolling. What are they looking for? They're snacking. Why are they eating? They're distracted and it's just overworked. These are not moral failures. They're compensations for chemistry that just simply doesn't get to reset. So here's something important that often gets overlooked. The body does not interpret busyness as productivity. Think about that one for a second. It interprets busyness as a demand. Okay? Naturally, the chemicals are going to supply that demand. And when demand is constant, the nervous system stays activated, doesn't it? Over time, the stress response loses its precision. The body starts reacting to smaller and smaller triggers. This is why people feel overwhelmed by things that wouldn't have affected them before, wouldn't have affected them at all. Their capacity hasn't disappeared, but their buffer size has. Burnout is not a psychological collapse. It's a biological signal that the cost of survival mode has exceeded the body's resources. Can't pay the loan back. At this stage, the body often forces a slowdown. Fatigue, apathy, emotional numbness, and it's not because it's failing, but it is because it's protecting itself from further damage. This is where many people might start to feel confused. They don't feel anxious anymore, and they don't feel motivated either. This isn't calm, it's conservation. The system has downshifted to prevent total collapse. And if this state isn't understood, people often push harder, thinking discipline will fix it. But effort doesn't repay biological debt. Regulation does. The body recovers not through escape, but through signal correction. Clear beginnings and endings, rhythm instead of urgency. Periods of true recovery, not stimulation masked as rest. In the next episode, we're going to look at one of the biggest reasons that stress chemistry has become chronic in modern everyday life. And it's not trauma, and it's not a weakness, but the way dopamine is being driven and manipulated through constant anticipation. Because when dopamine becomes dysregulated, survival chemistry gets reinforced, quietly but continuously. And that's where the cycle tightens. Understanding this is the turning point. Because once you see stress as a short-term loan, you stop blaming yourself for being tired and start asking the only question that matters. What does my nervous system need to repay this debt? I'll see you in the next one.